I've never been a fiction writer. And from the beginning, I wrote a few short stories when I was in college. But to me, part of writing has always been the accountability that comes along with nonfiction. This is one of the things in the book. The book itself says I could not be a novel, because part of the book is when you're growing up in an atmosphere where there's so little accountability. Proust has that famous line about how the best training to be a writer is sexual jealousy. And I think that for me, so much of why I wanted to be a writer in the first place was because I wanted to feel like I was being held to account in the world. And to me, the part of the story of this book is the book's ultimate existence as a document. Having had a relationship with someone who had such a hard time being accountable, to me, whenever I write anything, feel some part of the thrill for me, part of the challenge for me, is the accountability that comes along with calling something a piece of nonfiction. What drew me to the idea of pilgrimage in the first place was pilgrimage as mixed motive. That for your medieval peasant living in the cramped confines of his or her village, pilgrimage was a way to have an adventure under the banner of obligation. And that part of what this book is about is the idea that sometimes you can only experience and engage with your desires when you hear them as commands, or when you pretend as though they're commands. And this is one of the things that goes on in my dad's life too, that I think he has always had a hard time engaging with his desires except when he understands them as things that are beyond his control. And this is one of the ways that he's consistently described his sexuality. To me, this was one of the things that was so interesting about this experience, is that, sure, it cuts a corridor through the country of Spain, but what's going on in it is something that simultaneously is happening outside of time, and which is one of the reasons people do these, is to have an experience of time being suspended or time being altered, one's perception of time being changed. But it's also a different perception of place, that you are in Spain, but you are not exactly of Spain. And this has been true for a long time. So the experience of being on the Camino has always been an experience that it both is and is not of the place it's in. So this is one of the things that I talk about consistently in the book. I sort of joke that I have no interest in my environment, but this character is a little bit unreliable. And the character says, I have no interest in my environment, but then is consistently also describing his interactions with the people that he meets, his interactions with the buildings he walks by, his interactions with the landscape, while denying at the same time that he's interested in these things. Oh, I would definitely do the Camino again. I love the experience on the Camino. And I often think of trying to find even just a week to go do a week of it. I was in Europe for some magazine stories in September, and I was trying to figure out whether there was a way I could just take a week and go spend that week by myself walking along the Camino. I don't know if I'll find anytime soon a month or 5 weeks to do the whole thing again. I don't think you could pay me enough to go back to Japan and repeat that experience, although maybe I'd go repeat it in a car one day and see how it's changed. And of course, I have no interest in going back to Uman. As I was working on this book, the writers that I was reading were sort of the obvious ones. Bruce Chatwin is all over this book. Jeff Dyer is all over this book. I'm constantly reading Janet Malcolm, whether it's relevant or not. I discovered Rebecca West while I was working on this book, and Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, I think, is an amazing book that has its imprint on this. I think I first started thinking about the idea of how I might write about my father when I read J.R. Ackerley's My Father and Myself, which I think is an amazing book about the relationship between father and son, particularly the relationship that people have with the secret lives of their parents. I like the essays of Natalia Ginsburg were essays that I was reading. She writes very well about relationship to place. Just like one reaches the end of the Camino and thinks, oh, well, all of my expectations of arriving here and all of a sudden being a different person have been shown to be a fantasy. I think one also thinks that one's going to have these conversations with one's parents, and one's going to finally be able to hear the honest truth and have a candid conversation with one's parents about what their lives were like outside of their relationship to you. And I think one suspects that that is going to usher in a new era of general candor. And that's similarly a fantasy, that the kind of freedom that one stakes out in these conversations with one's parents is naturally an incremental freedom. And it's a freedom that one has to continue fighting for, that just because one has had one really honest, really candid conversation and one feels like one has been leveled with, doesn't mean that you're going to keep feeling like you're leveled with. And so just like, freedom is an everyday fight, I think honesty is an everyday fight. And that, sure, it's nice to have this object in the world that says, here are the resolutions that I have come to in these conversations and in thinking about these things. But that doesn't mean that everything is settled once and for all. Tom and I had a great time together, and I think that the playful competition that we had as writers was at least in part to deal with what felt so often like the absurd pointlessness of our errand of walking the Camino, that it's such a strange thing to decide to do and such an arbitrary thing to decide to do that one invents ways of reconciling oneself to the fact that one's doing it. So one way to do that is through documentation, to say, well, I'm doing this bizarre thing, but I'm doing it at least in part to write about how bizarre it is. And then I think that our writerly competition only was an intensification of that original documentary impulse. So we had the documentary impulse at least in part to explain why we were going to do this thing to be documented in the first place. And then the fact that we were competing about it just made us feel even more engaged in the project of documentation, which itself was a way of sort of evading the other reasons we might have had for doing this. That often it just seems, often documentation is just a scrim. And in this case, I think both Tom and I had a lot of reasons for doing this, like the other people we met on the Camino, all of whom were in moments of some fragility, some crisis, some sense of crisis, some feeling of transition. And everybody was doing this for their own reasons that were largely opaque to them, as our reasons were largely opaque to us. So instead of trying to articulate those obdurate reasons, the easiest thing to do is just to invent the reason and to invent this kind of post hoc justification of documentation. I think the influence that this book has had on my future work is that I've basically said everything I have to say about myself. I've said everything I have to say about my family. And I think I've said most of what I have to say about travel and authenticity and a lot of things that I wanted to try to talk about. So I have found myself, since this book, this is a book in which the narrative consciousness is the engine of significance. And it's a heavy burden to carry as when you're creating that narrator, because this is a book in which some things happen, obviously, but not a whole lot happens. And I've been drawn more to things that have a natural plot in the world, that feel like pieces of reporting rather than roving generators of digressive significance. Part of this book has to do with the way that my father and I have wrestled over the narrative of his life. He sees his life as having a particular shape, and to me, the events don't always support that shape. So this is about the struggle within a family to write the story of that family. If you have a hard time saying, this is the shape that I'm giving my life, you would be more tempted to say, this is the shape that I have found for my life. I'm not sure that there's that much more of a meaningful distinction between the two, except that one is, I'm going to take responsibility for describing my life this way, and one is going to say, I feel like I have inherited a life that looks this way.